Hello, today we're going to talk about the murder of Dan Markel. He lived in Tallahassee, Florida. He was a lawyer and he taught at Florida State University, or FSU. Now, on Tuesday of this week, the trial is going to begin for his mother-in-law for her part in the conspiracy to commit his murder. Tuesday is going to be them seating the jury, and then it should proceed from there. So hopefully it'll start Wednesday, maybe Thursday. Depends on how long it takes them to find jurors. So Dan Markel was born in Toronto, Canada, to Ruth and Phil Markel. He also has a sister, Shelley. He graduated in 2001 from Harvard Law School. Quite fancy. But he was very smart. He was practicing white-collar criminal defense and civil litigation. And then he met Wendy Adelson online in the fall of 2004. He joined the Florida State Law School in 2005, and he married Wendy in February of 2006. Then he was tenured at FSU in 2010. So we all know that when it comes to colleges, it's a big deal for a professor to get tenured, because then it's much more difficult to fire you if you were to make a boo-boo. Now, Wendy is also an attorney. She was going to law school at the University of Miami. But after they got married and they moved to FSU, I believe she finished her law schooling there at FSU. She was working at the FSU Center for Human Rights, and she worked there in immigration law for 7 years. Most of the time that they were in Tallahassee, they lived in the Trescott House, which is a house on Trescott Avenue. And that's just important because that is where Dan died. And so as we tell the story, we're going to be talking about Trescott Avenue a lot. So they rented for a little while and then they bought a house. Wendy moved out of that house in September of 2012, and she moved into a rental house that's about 15 to 20 minutes away. And this is because she served divorce papers to Dan. She decided she didn't want to be married anymore. Their marriage had difficulties from the beginning. Both of them were Jewish. However, Dan was kosher Jewish. And kosher means that you can't eat certain foods together. They can't be stored together. They can't be cooked together. They can't be cooked with the same utensils. And I know that there's a lot more involved, especially from the religious aspect of it. However, I'm not Jewish and I don't know all that information. But I do know that you can't cross-contaminate foods. And just knowing that tells me how difficult it is to remain kosher, because having to store things separately, not cook things together, not use the same utensils. You can't have a cheeseburger because you can't have dairy and meat together, and it just gets complicated. And so I can see the complications involved, even if I don't understand the entire religious aspect of being kosher. So at their wedding, this was a problem because his family and his friends tended to keep kosher, whereas hers did not. And so her family arranged the catering for the reception. And his family thought that the food was kosher, and it wasn't. At least it wasn't to the level of kosher that they keep. Different levels of kosher, I don't know. I'm sure it's like when Catholics fast on Fridays. I could talk about this because I was raised Catholic. We have different levels of what we consider fasting, and different people practice differently. Me, that meant no meat on Friday except for fish, and you can only have fish because it was served at the Last Supper, supposedly. Anyway, that's what my family believed. I don't know if that's true. I'm not big on religion. This is not going to be a big religious podcast because that is not my area of expertise. But that's just an example, okay? We're going to move on now. So at the wedding, it was a problem because his family and his friends and the rabbi couldn't stay and participate in the reception for as long as they wanted because there was no food that they could eat. And then later, when they had children, this issue came up again because we all know that if you have kids and they see that their friends are eating certain things and they want to eat that too and they can't, it's very difficult to explain to a small child that you can't have a cheeseburger because you can't eat cheese and meat together or something like that. Wendy told a story about she went to a party once with her kids and they had pizza there and they couldn't eat the pizza because the pizza wasn't kosher. She let them eat the pizza because no one wants their toddlers crying because they couldn't have pizza. When they got home, this upset Dan because Dan wanted them to be kosher. Now, when you are not a particularly religious person, this seems like a battle that you might just let be. However, if you are a really religious person and you believe that your eternity, your afterlife, whatever it may be that you believe in, depends on how well you are able to follow these rules on this planet, keeping kosher is at a whole new level. So it's not just about eating a piece of pizza. It's about learning the rules that will get you through your life, and then in the afterlife, you'll be in a better place. So if you can understand that, that's why he would be upset. Not that he's just like, I don't want my kids to have pizza or anything like weird. It's a religious belief. He really believed it. His family really believed it. And so, it's not just a small little thing to him. It's a big deal. And they needed to get this sorted out if they were going to be able to stay married and effectively raise these children together. This is probably a discussion they should have had before they got married and then before they had kids. Like, if we have kids, how are we going to raise them? Because you believe in more, I don't want to say fundamentalist because that's got a bad connotation, but a more strict religious practice than I do. And so we should hammer out how we're going to do this and how we're going to raise our kids and how things are going to work out in the future, because this would be a lifelong battle. You're going to have your kids until they're 18 and they can make their own decisions. This isn't something that you're just going to, this one instance with the pizza, and then it's never going to come up again. It's going to come up over and over and over again all throughout their lives. So one weekend in September of 2012, Dan went to do a presentation in New York, and while he was gone, Wendy decided she'd had enough and she was going to file divorce. So she texted him right before he was supposed to go give his presentation and told him that she wanted a divorce. And of course, not a surprise. They've been fighting, they've been arguing, they've been going to counseling. The divorce itself wasn't a surprise, but that she was going to say in this moment that this was it, that came as a surprise to him. So he got the first flight back home, got to his house later that evening, and he was in for a surprise because she wasn't there. His kids weren't there. A lot of his furniture wasn't there, along with other belongings, like the kids' stuff, because she cleared out the apartment, or cleared out the house of half of the things, apparently, and she left on their bed some nice little divorce papers. So she's gone. He doesn't know where she went. He doesn't know where his kids are. This is a big surprise to him. So eventually he discovered that she had taken the kids to Coral Springs, which is in the Miami area, and that's where her parents lived. So she had gone to where her parents lived. And she had also taken $350,000 out of the bank accounts. So she took her half of everything before he had a chance to say what was half. It was already gone. So, now we got to fight over it in court. And they fought. They fought a lot. They did do a, what is it called? A marital separation agreement that was official in July 31st of 2013. But they kept fighting after that. They kept filing motions back and forth in relation to all kinds of things. Some of them smart, some of them important, some of them stupid and not important. And smart and stupid are my qualifiers that I put on there, because I don't think arguing over every little thing when you have children is a good idea. But that's me. We all have our own opinions. So one of the motions that she filed was a motion to relocate the children from Tallahassee to Coral Springs, where her parents live. And her reasoning behind this, according to her, was that she would have more support. Her kids would have more support if they lived there with her and her parents and her brother who lived there. However, kids need both parents, and so the judge denied this motion on June 20th of 2013. And then she had to go back to Leon County, where Tallahassee is, and find a place to live with her kids. So Dan filed some motions. He filed a motion saying that Wendy wasn't truthful in regard to the financial statements that she filed with the court. He filed that in February of 2014. He also filed in March 26th of 2014 a motion for enforcement of the marital separation agreement for contempt and sanctions for violating the agreement, including failing to facilitate communication between him and the boys, failing to keep him informed of where the children were, failure to communicate about parenting decisions like the kids' schooling, diet, and extracurricular activities, and that her mother, Donna Adelson, was saying disparaging comments about him, and he wanted to limit her to supervised visits with the children in March of 2014. So these motions were scheduled to be heard in May of 2014, but they had to get a continuance. Part of that is because both of them had to get new counsel. And I don't do legal stuff either. I don't do religious stuff, and I don't do legal stuff. So you get the best that I can figure out, okay? Something to do with the contempt meant that both Wendy and him had to get new attorneys. Because for her, because she's a lawyer and he's filing contempt against her, saying that she lied about financial paperwork. That's a big deal being a lawyer, because you can be reported to the bar and you could lose your license or have penalties, I'm sure. I don't know, not a lawyer, but I'm sure. So anyway, big deal. They both got new attorneys. It hadn't been rescheduled yet to be heard, and it would never be rescheduled because he was killed before it could be rescheduled. On Friday, July 18th of 2014 at 11:02 a.m., there was a 911 call, It reported a shooting at the home of Dan Markel on Trescott Drive in Tallahassee, Florida. He was transported to the hospital, but he died 14 hours later from his injuries. At the time of the shooting, he was on the phone with Stuart Schlazer. Now, Stuart had worked at the School of Arts and Sciences, and this is one of the schools that Wendy and Dan were considering sending their oldest child to for the next school year, because this child was now able to go from daycare into school, and they had to figure out where they were going to send him. And so they were talking back and forth about it, and so Dan was talking to this gentleman about the school. So Stuart said that Dan told him that someone had pulled into the driveway behind him. He didn't know who this person was. And then Stuart heard a loud bang, and he heard some grunting and some other like labored breathing noises, but he never heard Dan say anything again. And he kept asking him, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" He then hung up with him and texted him. He didn't get a response, so he called 911 because he had no idea what was going on. You're on the phone with someone, you're never going to imagine that they're going to be shot while you're on the phone. And so you wouldn't recognize the sound or recognize what was happening. It would take some time. Now, Dan's neighbor across the street, Jim Geiger, he was sitting in his living room with his wife. She had gotten a new iPad, and they were setting it up, putting all the apps on there, doing all the things, and he heard the loud bang. He has a window, a large window in his living room that looks directly at Dan's house. It's a little kitty corner, but he could see Dan's house. So he got up and he looked out the window, and he saw a Prius, a light colored Prius. He saw it for a few seconds. He didn't note exactly what the color was, but it was a light colored Prius. Could have been white, could have been silver, light colored, back out of the driveway and leave. He didn't see anything else, but he was concerned. They had had some burglaries in the area lately, and so he thought he should go check on it. So he leaves his house, goes across the street to check on it. He sees that Dan's car is still on, and it's in the garage, but it's not moving, and he's like, doesn't seem like a burglary. Dan's probably just sitting in his car doing something. I'll go back to my house. So he went back to his house, but it still seemed off. Like he was getting that feeling in his gut that something was wrong. So he went back to the big window and watched out the window to see what he could see. Didn't see anything. Didn't see Dan leave. Never left. So then he was like, I gotta go check again. So he leaves his house, goes across the street to where Dan is, checks on him. This time he goes into the garage. He sees broken glass on the floor, and as he gets closer, he sees that Dan has blood on his head. He's kind of just moving his head back and forth, making kind of a little bit of a moaning noise. So he needs to call 911. Doesn't have his phone with him, of course. It's on the couch back home where they were working on the iPad. So he runs back home and gets his phone and calls 911. So the ambulance gets there. They get Dan. They take him to the hospital. Unfortunately, he does pass away 14 hours later, but he at least got to the hospital. So investigators had two main leads in this murder. As always, they're going to look at the family. So they're going to look at Wendy because she's the ex-wife. You got to look at the ex-wife. It's always the ex-wife or the ex-husband or the ex-somebody. So they got to look into her first. They also need to look into this Prius that left the driveway. So they actually kind of look at both at the same time. But they are going to look into both. Oh, and then there was kind of a third thing that they could look at. It was a case that Wendy brought up during her interview that Dan was consulting on. It was some rabbis in New York that had done some naughtiness. Turns out it wasn't connected, but I'll give you a quick rundown. Basically, in the Orthodox Jewish religion, the man has to give permission to the wife to have a divorce. And until he releases her from that marriage, she can't remarry unless there were some outstanding circumstances, and she can go to the group of rabbis, the something, and get special permission. But that's really rare. Typically, the man has to give her that release, and it's called a get. Well, there is a problem in this Orthodox Jewish community. Well, in several Orthodox Jewish communities. There's documentaries on it if you want to go online and, go on Netflix and watch some documentaries. They exist where the men refuse to give the get. And so the women end up getting extorted for money and all kinds of things that the men, basically it's just a power trip. They want whatever they can get because they're mad about the divorce. And so they will extort the women. They'll just hold them hostage. They just won't let them have the divorce, which means they can't remarry. And so it's a problem. So anyway, what these rabbis were doing was the woman or her family would pay them money, and the rabbis would hire someone to go kind of kidnap the guy, rough him up a little bit, and get him to agree to give the get. And then she could get divorced. Because apparently, well, they would have to give the get in front of a rabbi. So someone would go kidnap the guy, take him to a warehouse, convince him with violence to give the get. Then they'd bring in the rabbi, and the guy would say, I give the get. The rabbi would say, okay. And then they would let him go. But the rabbi heard the get, and so that would count. Because apparently you can do this under coercion. Don't know. Not my religion. Again. But anyway, this was illegal, of course. So the FBI or some law enforcement got involved, and they probably did a sting, and they caught these guys, and they caught the rabbis, and most of them ended up pleading guilty and getting some time, or they didn't get much. I think it was like 4 to 6 years, something like that. But anyway, Dan was going to be a consultant on this case, but it's not a big deal. It's not anything that would get him killed. A bunch of rabbis roughing people up. Not worthy of murder. So anyway, we're going to throw that option out. That was not a thing that happened. We're going to focus on finding the Prius, looking into Wendy, and her divorce. Those are the two things we have to investigate. Not we, the police. I mean, we're just random people on the internet. But anyway, man, my ADD is going off today. Oh well, hope you enjoy. If you don't, just go watch something else. There's lots of stuff on YouTube for you to watch. So the investigators tracked down Wendy Adelson. She was at a restaurant called Mosaic having lunch with some of her friends. They took her back to the police station and interviewed her for 6 hours without counsel present, which she makes a big deal of. However, we know she's a lawyer, so even though she's not a criminal lawyer, she is a lawyer, and hopefully she's not stupid. For a lawyer, she talked way too much. She said that she hoped that none of her friends had done this for her, thinking that it would make her life easier. She also said multiple times that her brother had told this terrible joke about how buying a TV as a divorce present for her was going to be cheaper than hiring a hitman. She said this multiple times, which is stupid. But anyway, she said that her parents were very angry with Dan, and she described it as a very beep up situation. Take that beep, put the F word in there. So according to Wendy, she wanted to move to the Miami area to be closer to her family because her and her kids would have more support. And Dan was like, no. And that really made her mom and dad upset because her mom and dad, their names are Donna and Harvey Adelson, are way too controlling and connected to their children, their adult children. Way too controlling. They have 3 children, Robert, Charlie, and then Wendy. Now, Robert is on limited speaking terms with his family, and there's a reason for that. He was really close to his parents growing up, and he was really close when he went to college. He went to college to be a doctor. So he was in Texas, I believe the Dallas area, doing his internship or his residency. While he was there, he met a wonderful lady that he dated and he wanted to marry. But his parents said, nope, can't marry her. We will cut you off because she's not Jewish. You have to marry a Jewish woman. So we will cut you off if you try to marry this lady who is not Jewish. And in fact, she was not Jewish. She was Hindu. So a little bit of a difference. Yeah. So Robert did not marry her. They struggled on and off for a little while, and then they broke up. He ended up meeting someone else, and he got married to her, but he quickly realized it was a mistake, and they got their marriage annulled. He then went back to the original lady who he loved, and they did get married. And his parents did attend the wedding. But he said after this whole thing on a podcast, I'm going to put the podcast in the comments or in the description because I can't remember. It's a Wondery podcast and I can't remember. Over My Dead Body. Wondery podcast, Over My Dead Body, interviewed him. Brain. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Anyway, he said that after all of this hullabaloo about him marrying this lady, he was much less close with his family than he had been before. Obviously, because they kind of made you waste a lot of time dating the wrong person. Because they're silly. So Donna and Harvey were really invested in Wendy being able to move to Miami with her grandchildren because I'm sure that they want to control the grandchildren as well. Because that's what these people like to do. They like to control their children and they like to control their grandchildren. There were emails from Donna to Wendy that were quite unhinged. And we're going to go into a separate episode where I have dug up some of the emails that she sent, as well as text messages and the calls from the jail, from Charlie to Donna, because they're wild, absolutely wild. So anyway, these emails, Donna was plotting different ways to either bully or coerce Dan into letting Wendy move to Miami. In one scheme, Donna suggested that they threatened to have the children baptized and converted to Catholicism. And she even knew that she could have this done in a couple weeks. That was all it would take. And then they also just thought, well, let's bribe him with $1 million. We could each put in $333,000, each meaning Harvey, Donna, and Charlie, and Wendy, and then give that to him and he'll fall for it, right? No, because he actually cares about his kids and not just money. You know, he's like a dad, like a real one that loves his children. What a concept. So in the motion that he had filed to keep Donna from having contact with his children that was unsupervised, he said that she had called him stupid because he was trying to take her sunshines away. Apparently her sunshines were her grandchildren. And he did not like that. And so he wanted her to have the supervised visits. So on July 20th of 2024, there was a memorial held for Dan. And Donna and Harvey and Wendy were there, of course, because it would look really bad if they didn't show up. While they were there, a Tallahassee investigator spoke to Donna and Harvey and said, hey, can you meet up with me before you head back to Miami so I can ask you a few questions? And they were like, sure, no problem. Let's get, well, not today because, we're busy, but then we'll get this taken care of. We'll get the questions answered so we can head back to Miami. No problem. The next day, on the 21st, the investigator called. They were already on their way to South Florida, to Miami. The investigator called Wendy on her cell phone. She answered because he had called, I guess, from a different number, and she didn't recognize it. And so as soon as he started speaking and identified himself, she hung up. And then a few minutes later, her lawyer called and said, yeah, she's not going to talk to you anymore. And so she didn't. After that, the Adelsons never spoke with investigators. A year later, the Markels told investigators that they had received notification that Wendy had changed the last name of the children. She also changed one of the middle names of the children because it's a Jewish tradition to honor a deceased family member with the middle name. And so it was in honor of Dan's deceased maternal grandmother, and that middle name was changed. Wendy said it was to protect the kids from the media. However, the name Adelson is all over the media just as much as Markel, so it's not really saving them, is it? It's not. And the middle name had nothing to do with that. No one knew what their middle name was because they're kids, and that's stupid. She just wanted to erase Dan from their lives completely. Okay, so the police, they had delved into interviewing Wendy, got as far as they could with that information. Meanwhile, at the same time, they're still investigating this light-colored Prius that was seen in his driveway. First, we're going to go through a little bit of a geography lesson because it'll make it easier if you don't know the geography of Florida. So, Tallahassee is in the northwest part of Florida, kind of by that little panhandle. Miami and all of the areas where the Adelson family lives is in southeast Florida. And so Donna and Harvey have a house or some sort of residence in Coral Springs, which is north of Fort Lauderdale, but also in that general metropolitan area. Charlie lives in Fort Lauderdale, which is a little north of Miami. And then Donna and Harvey also have a condo, I believe, in Miami Beach, which again, Miami area. This is all the Miami metropolitan area. So I'm going to refer to it as Miami or South Florida. Even though it's different cities, it's just easier. So that's what we're going to do. So anyway, to drive from Tallahassee to Miami will take you about 7 hours, give or take traffic, okay? So it's far, it's not close, okay? Okay. We're also going to go over some of the players in the story to make it easier for you to understand who is who and how they're connected. So at this point in time, there have already been 3 trials. One person turned on everybody else, Luis Rivera, and he was sentenced. He didn't have a trial because he pled guilty. Sigfredo Garcia and Katherine Magbanua, they went to trial together. He was convicted. She had a hung jury. So she had another trial and she was convicted. Then they had another trial for Charlie Adelson and he was convicted as well. Since Katie's trial, she actually turned and testified at Charlie's trial. So anyway, those are the main people as of now, but we're going to go into it a little bit. So Sigfredo Garcia has been friends with Luis Rivera since they were little kids. They grew up in the neighborhood together. They've been friends forever. Sigfredo Garcia is dating Katie Magbanua. Her name is Katherine Magbanua. We're calling her Katie. They dated on and off for a long time. They have 2 children together. At times in testimony, she is referred to as his wife because in this group of friends, they don't get legally married. They just call each other their wife or husband. Because there's another one. Luis has a wife, Jessica, not legally married, but she has his kids. So it is what it is. Katie also dated Charlie Adelson. And then Charlie Adelson is the brother of Wendy. This is how everybody's connected. Okay, so we're going to go through this. So the neighbor, Jim Geiger, sees the light-colored Prius. The police, they start tracing Dan's steps that day to see if the Prius had followed him. They saw that he had gone to the daycare at 8:50 in the morning and dropped his kids off. He then went to a gym and did some exercising. It's called Premier Gym. So after he dropped his kids off at the daycare at 8:50, he called Wendy at 9:02 in the morning. She didn't answer. He left a message. It was in regards to the school situation because he was going to talk to this other guy who used to work at the school to get information about the school and then talk to her later in the day. So at 9:11, Dan pulls into the Premier Health and Fitness gym parking lot. Following him is a light-colored Prius. Dan parks, the Prius parks somewhere. Dan goes into the gym, works out for a little over an hour, comes back out. The Prius, while he is in the gym, is parked, and then it'll move to another spot and park for a while, and then it'll move to another spot, park for a while, then it'll move to another spot, park for a while. Meanwhile, he's in the gym working out. He gets out at 10:38 a.m., goes to his car, and then leaves the parking lot, and the Prius follows him. They leave on East Village Square Boulevard towards Thomasville Road. So they looked and found some video footage from the city buses. And at 10:44, they show Markel's car going southbound on Thomasville Road. And the Prius is still following him about 10 seconds later. Then the 911 call came in at 11:02. And another bus got a shot of the Prius going northbound towards the interstate at 10:55. So this would be after the murder, leaving, going towards the interstate. Now, they didn't just get all this evidence quickly. Some of it they did, but not all of it, because you have to file subpoenas. Some of these companies are pretty big, and it takes a while to get the information back. And then it's a lot of data, and you have to go through the data, and it just takes time. So there was a 2-year period where no one was arrested for this murder. And then the arrests kind of started coming in after that. So from these videos, they were also able to tell that it was probably a 2006 to 2009 Prius, and the color was silver pine mica. So a light metallic silver green color. On the passenger side, the mirror was black instead of the factory color, and there was a missing tow hook cover in the bumper of the car. And there was also a SunPass toll tag in the window of the car, which is helpful. So SunPass is the system that is used in South Florida and Central Florida for tolls. And they could also see that the passenger of the car had a white t-shirt on. So Detective Isom contacted the Florida Department of Transportation, got all of the SunPass registrants that had a Prius, which was a lot. So that in itself was not very helpful. So they had to look at cell phone data. So they looked at everyone in Wendy's family and got their cell phone data, and none of them were in Tallahassee that day except for, of course, Wendy, because she lived there. She's supposed to be there. They also obtained a cell phone tower dump for the tower that is near the Premier Gym. And when they cross-referenced the numbers from that tower dump with contacts that were in the cell phone data from the Adelsons, they found one number that matched. On July 1st, a phone number had called Harvey Adelson and left a voicemail. And a few seconds or a few minutes after that call, Katherine Magbanua had called Harvey Adelson's number as well. Turns out, what Katie will testify to later, was that Sigfredo Garcia was jealous that she was dating Charlie, and he had gone through her phone and got what he thought was Charlie Adelson's number, turned out to be Harvey Adelson's number. He called and left a nasty voicemail, and then she called and apologized because to her it was embarrassing. So the police had several ways of connecting that phone number to Sigfredo Garcia, to Luis Rivera, and to Katherine Magbanua. And which came first, I'm not really sure, but we're just going to go over all of them. So first of all, in Sigfredo Garcia's phone information, the most frequent contact that he had was Katherine Magbanua, which makes sense because he has children with her. The second most common contact was Luis Rivera. And Luis Rivera's phone number was in that cell tower dump as well. They just didn't have a way of connecting it to begin with, but once they had it, they connected it. Also, later on, there are other ways that they connected those phone numbers as well that we will get into. So, they checked the toll booth records from all of the toll booths that someone would take if they were driving from Tallahassee to Miami or Miami to Tallahassee. And in doing so, they narrowed it down to the July 16th to July 18th because he was killed on the 18th. So they looked at that time period. They only found one car that matched that time period. So going westbound on I-75 on July 16th at 2:18 p.m. was a Prius. Going eastbound on July 18th at 5:23 was a Prius. So they got the registration information for that toll tag, discovered that it belonged to a North Miami business called Save Gas Hybrid Rent-A-Car. Long name. It's been referred to multiple ways throughout this whole thing. So we're going to pick one and go with it. So by the time they found the car, it had already been sold twice. It was painted white. There's very little evidence that they could get from the car itself other than they found it. But the rental agreement was useful. The car was rented to Luis Rivera, and he had put as an address his mother-in-law's address. He also put 2 phone numbers, his phone number and Sigfredo Garcia's phone number. But for that phone number, he just put down brother. Those phone numbers were the same phone numbers that were on the tower dump from the gym. And when they did a search for those phone numbers, like through social media and stuff, they found the phone number that was listed as brother on Facebook belonged to an account for Tuto Dade, which Tuto is Sigfredo Garcia's nickname. And obviously he had a picture of himself on there. It was his account. It's his phone. And then also they further corroborated this because this phone also called Magbanua. I think also he used that phone number on a pawn ticket to pawn something, and that pawn ticket had his fingerprint on it as well as that phone number, so they were really able to connect that phone number to him, which is important because these people use burner phones, as we will learn. So they had their 2 suspects, and then they were able to get cell phone information from these 2 suspects' phones so that they could track them prior to and during the murder. They learned that in June they did a trial run, sort of. Sigfredo and Rivera went up to Tallahassee. But first, on June 2nd, you see Katie's cell phone travel from her house. She was at home at 8:25 p.m. At 8:34 p.m., her phone is located between her and a rental car company called Comfort Rent-A-Car. And then at 8:53, her phone is actually in the area of Comfort Rent-A-Car. Then her phone travels back from the rental car place to her house. Rivera will later testify that Garcia had rented the car for this trip, which makes sense because Katie probably took him to the rental car place. During this trip to the rental car place, she received 2 phone calls from Charlie Adelson. And then at 10:01 p.m., she had called Garcia. But at 9:48 p.m., Garcia had already gotten a speeding ticket in the rental car. So the next day, he actually returned that car and got a different one. On June 4th, around noon, Rivera's phone travels from Miami to Tallahassee. And during this trip, Rivera gets a speeding ticket in Gainesville, Florida, because apparently they can't go the speed limit when they're trying to commit crimes. Rivera said that he thought they were going there to commit a robbery, but halfway there, Garcia told them that they were there to commit a murder, and that the murder was so that a lady could get her kids back. And Garcia had a piece of paper that had the address and a picture of Dan Markel on it, so he had information on who he was supposed to kill. On June 5th, from 12:33 to 3:25, Rivera's phone is in the area of Dan Markel's house, but he said that Dan had his kids with him, and so they didn't commit the murder. They just went back home to Miami, and by 11 p.m. they were back in Miami. And they have pings from his phone to show all that. Now, they didn't have location data for Garcia's phone at the time. because his phone was through Metro PCS. It got bought out by T-Mobile, and in that merger, they lost the location data. But we have Rivera's, and we do have Garcia's for July. On June 6th, the rental car is back at Katherine Magbanua's residence, and you see on that day it is driven back to the rental car is driven back to the rental car place, and you see her phone go with it. So July 14th of 2014, there are communications between Katie and Charlie. From text messages, it looks like they are meeting for dinner, hanging out at her house a little bit, and then he went home. Early morning of 7:15, there's communications between Garcia and Katie at 12:48 and 1:56 a.m. And then at 9:09 a.m., Garcia calls Comfort Rent-A-Car. And then Rivera and Garcia communicate back and forth. And at 4:28 p.m., Garcia calls the hybrid rental place where they ended up getting the Prius. Rivera rented the Prius, but Garcia was there, and both of their phones show that they were at the area of the car rental place at the same time. Between 6:30 and 9:30 p.m., there were several communications back and forth between Katie and Garcia. Katie's location was consistent with her house, and Garcia was at Shrimp's house. Shrimp is his current girlfriend at the time. Her real name is Stephanie Carmona. Then at 9:30 p.m., Garcia's phone is at Katie's house. The rental car is also at Katie's house at 10:25. So the rental car has a GPS, and it sporadically shoots out a location. So occasionally we get a location from the rental car so we know where it is. But it's not a super frequent thing. July 16th, 2014, just after noon, the cell phones of Garcia and Rivera traveled together to Tallahassee. The westbound, there's a westbound toll transaction at 2:18 p.m. The two cell phones arrive in Tallahassee around 1 a.m. on July 17th, 2014, and they stayed at the Budget Inn that night. So on the 17th, Garcia's phone is in the area of Dan Markel's residence at 11:47, 11:58, 2:30, and 2:45. Rivera was in the same area at 2:30. That night, they stayed at the Broadway Inn. Rivera said that he had seen a lady watching them, and he told Garcia that the lady was staring at them. She was on her phone, and Garcia said, "Oh, well, that's the lady with the kids," basically the one who had paid them. Garcia had then gotten a call from Magbanua saying that she had seen them and they had to get out of there. She also told them that day that they had to hurry up and get the job done because Dan Markel was going to be going out of town for the weekend. Also on the 17th, at some point, Garcia shot the gun off inside the car and hit the gas line. So they had already met a guy in June named Shadrach Nobles. He's probably their drug dealer. I'm going to guess that he sold them cocaine. This whole time they're hopped up on cocaine and alcohol, by the way. So when the car stopped working, they called him and he gave them a ride to AutoZone to get the parts to fix it, and Garcia fixed it. He also had rented the hotel at the Broadway Inn for them, and they had been in contact with him. He kind of helped them do things while they were there and sold them cocaine. Yeah. And then in 2016, when police went and found that Prius, they did find the hole in the floorboard and where the gas line was fixed, which just kind of corroborated the story that Luis Rivera had told them. July 18th at 12:01 a.m., Katie calls Garcia. And she again said, you got to get it done. He's going to leave town. Because I guess Wendy had been texting Dan back and forth all week to get his schedule so that she would know when he would leave town. And then at 12:07, Katie talks to Charlie. And at 12:34 in the morning, Katie is talking to Charlie. And then in the morning, Rivera's phone starts at the roadway inn. Then at 8:09 a.m., Wendy and Donna talk on the phone. Then Charlie and Wendy talk on the phone. Then Katie and Charlie talk on the phone between 9 and 10 a.m. The video shows the Prius enter the gym at 9:16. Garcia and Rivera's phones are there at the gym as well. They have pings at 9:36 and 9:58 a.m. The Prius leaves the gym around 9:38, following Dan Markel. Then some point, they turn off their phones because the last ping to either phone was that one at 9:58. They pulled into the driveway. Garcia got out of the car, shot Dan twice, got back into the car, and they drove off. They went to the interstate and headed back to Miami. Now, at about 12:30 a.m., Garcia apparently turned his phone back on because he received a bunch of notifications and text messages that hadn't previously went through. Then he called Katie to tell her that the murder was done, and she said that she already knew. And Rivera is the one who told this in his testimony because he was sitting next to him and had overheard the conversation. So at the time, they were in Alachua County, which is about 1.5 hours from where the murder occurred. There were fewer communications on the trip back to Miami than there were on the way to Tallahassee, but they did have the toll transaction at 5:23 p.m. going eastbound. And Rivera told the police that they had stopped at a bridge on some random lake and threw the gun into the water. The investigators took him to try to find this bridge, but they were unable to find it. So who knows? It's Florida. There's a lot of waterways, so it could have been anywhere. So Rivera and Garcia then went to the ATM where Rivera withdrew some money. The police have the video footage of that, and it shows that Garcia is sitting in the passenger seat with a white t-shirt on, which the bus video did see that the passenger was wearing a white t-shirt. It also showed that Rivera was driving, Garcia was in the car. He said they went home, got dressed, and went out partying. And he was told that he would get the money the next day. That night, Katie went to Charlie's house. She said that he was nervous. He had a gun on him. He didn't normally carry a gun on him. He had guns, but they normally weren't in his gun safe. But this night, he actually had a gun on him, and he was nervous. She said that he had given her a Xanax, and then they both fell asleep, so she doesn't remember too much about it. Oh, she did remember that right before she arrived, he made a comment that his parents had been there. The next morning, he had put the money in the trunk of her car for her. It was inside a Ziploc bag, then inside a paper bag, then inside a grocery bag. She said the money was damp, that a few days later she noticed there was some mold growing on it. Ew, gross. So she asked Garcia about it, and he said just to blow dry the money. She said she thought that the money was wet because his parents, Charlie's parents, had probably tried to literally wash the money. You know, like in the washing machine. Gross. They're so smart. I mean, They're just the smartest co-conspirators ever, these people. So the next morning, Katie tries to get a hold of Garcia and she can't. So she goes over to Rivera's house because they got to pay him, right? Well, Garcia shows up. So her and Garcia go to Rivera's house and distribute the money to Rivera. Now, the reason she couldn't get a hold of Garcia was because he had already dumped his phone. Because again, burner phones. These people use burner phones. They're criminals. Burner phone. He threw it away already. Got rid of it. So she couldn't get a hold of him that way. Luis had actually gotten a hold of him by sending one of his friends over to get him because Garcia was at Shrimp's house. You know, his girlfriend's house. So they went out to the car because Rivera didn't want his girlfriend, to know that he had gotten a bunch of money because then she would want some. So they go out to the car and Garcia gives him the money. And for his part, it was $35,000. But Garcia gave him an extra $2,000 just for helping him out as a friend. The money was all in hundreds, in $1,000 stacks that were stapled together. The money was also damp. In total, they were to be paid $100,000. Garcia would get $40,000, and then Katie would get the rest. So on May 25th, 2016, Sigfredo Garcia was arrested. He was questioned, and he denied ever being in Tallahassee and ever going on a trip with Rivera. On June 28th, 2016, Luis Rivera was arrested for this case. Now, Luis Rivera was already in jail. He was in federal prison because the feds had gotten him on a federal RICO case. He was serving 12 and a half years for that case. And that is a case to do with the fact that he was a member of the Latin Kings. I don't think I mentioned this before, but he was a pretty high up member of the Latin Kings. And so he was serving a federal sentence for that. In September of 2016, Rivera offered a proffer to investigators, and then in October he pled guilty and took a deal. Basically, he was sentenced to 19 years that would be served consecutively with his 12 and a half years that he was serving federally. So total, he would get 19 years for the two charges, or not charges, the two different sets of criminal cases that he had. He did give them a lot of useful information. He was the first one who told them about the stapled money that helped them connect Charlie Adelson to the case. And he also told them about Garcia shooting the gas line. They didn't know about that. So that was a detail that was used to corroborate his story. Now, the stapled money, he only knew that the money had come from the lady, but the fact that the money was stapled led them to Charlie, because Julie Umchinda is Charlie's ex-girlfriend, and she testified that she had seen money in Charlie's house that was stapled together, that he would frequently staple stacks of money together. She also told investigators that Donna Adelson had told her that she feels like Dan is back from the grave haunting her. Well, he's going to keep haunting you because soon you're going to be in jail just like your son. Katherine Magbanua was arrested October 1st, 2016. She stood trial with Garcia. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison and 30 years consecutive. Katie had a hung jury, so she got a new trial. Her new trial was delayed, though, for 6 years because of COVID and everything else going on. So she was retried May 16th of 2022 and was found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Now, since then, I believe in April of 2022 is when Charlie Adelson was arrested. I don't have the date for when he actually went to trial, but his trial is over and he was also convicted and is serving life in prison. We'll get into more details on that as we go along with the story. We still have to focus more on the Adelson family and how they're all connected into this situation. I also am going to try to put in more information about Dan Markel and his life and his family, because we're focusing a lot on the Adelsons and they're horrible people. So I'm going to put some more details about the good people in this story, because they are good people. Not the Adelsons, don't get me wrong, they're bad people. I don't want to be misconstrued. That could have been taken poorly. Ooh. Anyway, Tuesday is when jury selection begins for the Donna Adelson trial, and I will hopefully be doing little updates. This week will probably just be one update, because by the time they do the jury selection, there's only going to be a couple days of testimony. And with all of these cases, a lot of the testimony is the same, because it's the same information, the same basic information of what happened with Garcia and Rivera and Katherine Magbanua. But when it gets into the new information involving the Adelsons, I'll make sure to give you some really good updates on that information so you can have it. But we'll also be going into the emails and the text messages and the phone calls from the jail and all that sort of stuff in future episodes. I'm not sure when they will be out. There will at least be one next week. I'm not sure what all that's going to cover yet, but we'll get there. We'll get into it. I hope you have a good week.